An educated slave. Laura put the tea kettle back on the stove. Upstairs, all was silent. Were Bert and Martin listening to the dogs too? Running to the foot of the stairs, she called, "Bert, where are you?" Bert's answer came from the spare bedroom. "Come on up." She found him standing alone in the chamber that lay between her room and the back stairs. "Where's Martin?" she asked. "See if you can find him." "Bert, this is no time for games. Did you hear the dogs?" "I did, and this isn't a game. I want to know if Martin's in a good hiding place." "Oh, all right." Laura turned slowly in the middle of the room. "Under the bed?" She lifted the edge of the white bedspread. No one. "That would be too simple," Bert said scornfully. "Then there's only the wardrobe." Laura opened the door of the tall cabinet that stood against the south wall. A strong smell of camphor almost overwhelmed her as she faced the close-ranked row of winter clothes hanging on the rack. Backing up, she knelt to look at the floor of the closet and saw a scuffed pair of shoes and above them a pair of thin ankles. Laura stood up. "His feet show. You ought to put a row of shoes under the clothes." Bert scowled, annoyed as usual at being told what to do. Martin's dark head poked out from the stored clothes. "That's a good idea, Miss Laura. There's some shoes back here in the corner." He disappeared again to rummage on the floor of the wardrobe. Laura felt worried. It had been too easy to find Martin. "Can't you do better than that?" she asked Bert. "I didn't say it was a perfect place to hide him," Bert said, "but it was the best I could think of." "How about the attic?" "Abby cleaned it out. You couldn't hide a mouse in it." Martin backed out of the wardrobe and began to place shoes in a row beneath the hanging garments. He paused and lifted his head as a dog howled again in the distance. "Listen to those hounds!" He shook his head and went back to arranging the shoes. "If they ever catch up with me, they'll tear me up in little pieces. They'll be so mad at all the work I made for them." Laura was struck with a new thought. How can those dogs track you? They'd have to sniff something you wore before they could follow your trail. Martin looked up. "I guess after my master hired a slave catcher, he gave him an old shoe of mine or something. He's a powerful, determined man." "But there are lots of slave hunters in Lewiston looking for you. That's what Joel said. Your master couldn't have hired all of them." "Maybe they read the posters. I saw some when I was coming here. They're nailed up on barns and trees. They tell what I look like, and they say my master will give a big reward to anybody who catches me." Laura was still puzzled. How do the slave catchers know where to search? Bert said, "Everybody knows runaway slaves head for Canada." "There are lots of other places on the border besides Lewiston," Laura pointed out. "Look, Laura, there are hundreds of fellows making a living as slave catchers, especially since the fugitive slave law was passed. And they just sit themselves down at a border town and wait till they see a black face." Bert sounded impatient. "Lots of them don't care whether the person they catch is a free man or a slave. They'll ship any blacks down south and sell them like cattle." "But Joel said the slave catchers are looking for Martin. How do they know he's here?" Bert exploded. "How do I know? Ask Joel. Maybe someone recognized Martin when he was on the way here." Laura bristled. "You don't have to be so cross just because I ask a few questions." She sailed out of the room before Bert had time to retort. As she went down the hall to her room, she heard Bert say to Martin, "I'd better get outside again. I still have chores to do." It was a day for interrupted tasks, thought Laura. While she finished straightening her room, she puzzled over her newly acquired information on the slave catchers. She wasn't sure whether or not to believe Bert and Martin. She thought it was natural for a slave owner to try to get back his property, but it surely wasn't right for people to catch a freed man and sell him down south. Then she remembered a black who had been bought by the owner of the plantation next to Uncle Jim's. He had insisted that he was a freed man and that he had been picked up by a slave catcher. No one had believed him, and for all she knew, he was still working for his new owner. Downstairs, she heard a rattle of dishes, reminding her that she had left the tea kettle singing on the stove and the soap ready in the dishpan. It didn't seem likely that Bert was washing the breakfast dishes, but who was? The kitchen was empty, and the rattling sounds came from the pantry, where Laura discovered Martin at work with the dishpan set up on a shelf. He turned around as Laura pushed open the door. "I came in here so I'd be out of sight," he said. "If someone comes to the back door, I can run out through the dining room and up the front stairs. If they come to the front door, I can hurry up the back stairs." His smile asked approval of his foresight. "It's a good plan," Laura agreed. "And it's good of you to do the dishes. Did Bert ask you to do them?" "No, he's still outside." Laura leaned against the cupboard. Here was a chance to find the answer to some of the questions that were plaguing her. "Martin, you said your father taught you to read. Isn't that unusual? The slaves I knew down in Virginia couldn't read or write." "Yes, miss, it's unusual, all right. It's against the law to teach a black man to read. But my pappy once had a kind master who taught him and let him have books to read. My pappy," he said proudly, "used to keep the account books for that master." Laura studied Martin's face, trying to decide if he were telling the truth. "My Uncle Jim said it wasn't any use educating a slave," she said. "That's what Mr. Spencer, our new master, said too." "What happened to your father's master, the good one who taught him to read?" "He died, and all his slaves were sold to Mr. Spencer." The back door opened and Laura and Martin jumped. Laura opened the pantry door a crack. "It's just Bert," she said, relieved. Bert joined them in the pantry. "You shouldn't be downstairs," he told Martin. "I'm almost finished," Martin reassured him. "Then I'll go up and stay there. Sitting and waiting, that's the hardest thing to do." "I'm going to dig potatoes so I can keep an eye on the road," Bert said. "But first, I'll find a book for you." "I'd like that," Martin chuckled. "My master sure would be surprised if he knew a white boy was offering me a book to read. He sure hated to see a slave reading." Bert spoke up. "Show Laura what your master did to you for teaching one of your friends to read." "I don't think I ought to do that, Mr. Bert," objected Martin. Laura's curiosity was aroused. "What do you mean?" "Well," said Martin hesitantly, "Mr. Spencer said he'd teach me to forget how to read." Laura was still mystified. "I don't understand." Bert attempted to explain. "Pa says slave owners think it's harder to keep a slave in his place if he can read and write. He told me about an educated slave named Nat Turner who led an uprising against white people. Ever since that happened, plantation owners are more scared than ever of letting their slaves learn anything." "I've heard about Nat Turner," said Laura, "but I don't see how Martin's master could make him forget how to read." "Show her, Martin," Bert insisted. Martin shook his head, but Bert unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of the boy's shirt and pulled it down from the shoulders. Turning Martin around so Laura could see his back, Bert said grimly, "What do you think of Mr. Spencer's teaching?" Laura gasped. Martin's back was crossed with long scars that she knew must have been caused by a heavy whip.